Welcome to our Pechakucha on Greek philosophy. Greek philosophy is probably one of my favorite belief systems among the belief systems that we're studying, and I'm really excited about this one. There's a lot to get through, there's a lot of information about these things, so stick it out. I think you'll think it's really cool too. Greek philosophy obviously begins in Greece, and we're really going to be talking about the Athenian school, which is probably the most famous Greek philosophy, these three gentlemen. And it's called the Athenian school because it was focused in Athens, and about the 5th century BC, 2,500 years ago, when Athens was a center of knowledge and learning and an economic power. The first person we're going to talk about is Socrates. He was the first of those of that Athenian school, and he's credited with beginning what's called the Socratic method, which is about asking questions, looking for answers. He didn't leave any writings of his own, he didn't write anything down, and he was eventually sentenced to death by the Athenians for his philosophy. His student, one of his most famous students, was Plato, and Plato actually did write some things down, and he reportedly wrote down what Socrates said, but we're not sure if it's Plato's beliefs or Socrates' beliefs, but we are sure that it is a complete set of thoughts, and some people have said that all of philosophy after Plato is just footnotes to Plato. Aristotle was one of Plato's students at Plato's Academy. He's also incredibly well-known and well-renowned as a philosopher. He taught Alexander the Great, and he often disagreed with Plato. So the rest of this presentation is kind of going to be an account of the way that Plato and Aristotle dealt with some different questions. So here we have ignosi, which is the Greek word for knowledge. What is the world like? And we're going to talk about what Plato and Aristotle think about that idea. So we're going to kind of zoom in on each of those two and discuss. So what is the world like for Plato? Well, he says that the world is a poor copy of perfect forms, that somewhere, not in our physical world, but someplace else, there are these perfect ideas of different things, and in our world, we just see imperfect copies of them. So you might see a notebook or a computer. Well, that's not a perfect computer. There are some problems with it. And to kind of describe this idea, he has a very famous allegory called the allegory of the cave, where here are the people in the world are here, and instead of seeing real things, they see the shadows reflected from this fire. But they don't see anything else, so they think that those are the real shadows. And he says, that's just like us. Aristotle's view is quite different. He says, no, there are no these perfect forms. Instead, experience allows us to understand the essence of things. That through our experience, we can understand what it is that's most important about things, what makes them the thing that they are. And we can learn that by looking at something carefully and by looking at lots of examples of something. So, for instance, here we have 4 different chairs, and we can look at them and say, okay, yeah, I can see. Even though these are different things, they're made of different things, my experience allows me to see that each of them has the essence of a chair. It has someplace to sit, and it would work as a chair regardless of what it's made of, when it was made, those kind of things. Aristotle also is credited with beginning logos, or logic, that's the Greek word there, and he uses this form called the syllogism. So he says, or Socrates is a man, all men die, therefore Socrates will die. And that ends up being a very powerful kind of logic that people use for a long time. Another key question for the Greek philosophers is the question of politikos. That's the Greek word, and that, like, how should we organize society? Politics. What can we do to organize things there? And that's a really big question for a lot of these Greek philosophers, and a question for us now too. For Plato, he thinks that the world should be ruled by philosophy kings. This is obviously this is a painting by Raphael of the Academy, but you have Plato and Aristotle disagreeing there in the middle. But Plato would say that the philosophers, the people who think about things in the world, should be the kings, should rule, and other people should listen to them, because the philosophers, they actually know what's going on. Aristotle, again, has a kind of different perspective. I don't know if he'd necessarily be against the rule of the philosophy kings, but he's more interested in examining how cities work, and thinking about cities as kind of a microorganism, as the main organization of people, and breaks that down from cities to families and so on. Finally, one of the most interesting aspects of Greek philosophy for me is ethiki, which is the Greek word for ethics, and how should we make personal decisions. And that's, I think, one of the most interesting things that these guys talked about, because in some ways this is the part that might be most useful for us these days. And for Plato, we talked about the forms, the ideal forms before. For Plato, the most important ideal form is the form of the good. Somewhere out there in the world, there is an idea, a perfect idea of good. And we, in our humanness, have some kind of access. Depending on how well we think about it, we have some access to that idea. Aristotle has a completely different view. He says that men and women have to focus on this idea of virtue. This is a painting of Pericles, who is generally considered virtuous, and that we have to focus on developing ourselves as virtuous, making ourselves virtuous people. And that's a skill that we can develop. So if we do virtuous things, for instance, these wonderful people in the green aprons are feeding people at a homeless shelter. If we do virtuous things, we will become more virtuous. And so action can actually change ourselves, and then we'll do more virtuous action, become more virtuous, and eventually move towards a kind of a eudaimonia, or happiness. And that's the goal for Aristotle. One of the last things I want to talk about is episteme, which is kind of the Greek word for science. And Plato wasn't so interested in this, but Aristotle made really great strides in not necessarily scientific discoveries, but in the idea that by looking at the world, we can find out about science. So that's all the time that I have for today. Thank you very much for listening. I know I couldn't get into anything in any depth, but if you're interested, there's lots more information about these things. There are, in addition to Wikipedia, there is the two really great online philosophy encyclopedias, the Internet Encyclopedia of Philosophy and the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy. So please check them out. They're awesome. And I hope you enjoyed the talk on Greek philosophy.